Okay, good morning. It looks like most people are here, so we'll go ahead and get started. I don't see really anybody else trickling in. I'm Jeannie Rose. I'm the Vice President and COO of DevWorks International. We were formerly known as SID-USA. I'm very excited to be introducing this panel on countering corruption, a topic the Biden administration has placed at the center of its development agenda. And indeed, this morning, Samantha Power, Administrator Power, referred to the growing corruption globally as one of the major challenges facing development. Here to moderate our panel is Ms. Romina Bandura. She is a senior fellow with the Project on Prosperity and Development and the Project on U.S. Leadership in Development at CSIS. Her current research focuses on the future of work in developing countries and the United States' economic engagement in the developing world. Ms. Bandura is an economist with more than 20 years of experience in international development research, policy analysis, and project management. So, Ms. Bandura, we're very excited to kick off this panel. I know it's going to be very interesting.
Yes, thank you, and welcome to everybody. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be here and to moderate this important discussion today. Maybe I'll, let's introduce our panelists to begin with, and then we will kick off. Yes, Jennifer.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Lewis. I serve as Deputy Director for the Anti-Corruption Task Force here at Usaid. It's a pleasure to be here.
Hi, my name is Jeannie Mans. I am an Integration Officer on the Anti-Corruption Task Force, where my detail will be ending shortly, but I'll continue working with Jen and the rest of the folks from my regular perch, which is as a Senior Governance Advisor in Usaid Center for Democracy, Human Rights, and Governance. Nice to be here.
Hi, everyone. Pleasure to be here. I'm Moussa Traoré. I sit in the Center for Economics and Market Development of our DDI Bureau at Usaid, and I've been supporting the anti-corruption task force that we have specifically on integration with regard to the economic growth sector. And in my traditional role, I'm the business enabling environment advisor within our center. Pleasure.
Welcome. Well, thank you so much. And of course, I want to congratulate, the Biden administration for launching this first ever anti-corruption strategy. The United States has been really a global leader on the fight against corruption since the 1970s with the 1977 U.S. Foreign Corruption Practices Act, and obviously the work of the OECD, the Anti-Bribery Convention, also initiatives such as the Open Government Partnership, and of course the work of the UN and World Bank and many others. Anti-corruption is a topic that many citizens in the developing world are very concerned with. I'm going to be very simplistic, but whenever you see a presidential election and there are polls and surveys of what citizens want out of the new leadership, it's always something around economics, so jobs, fighting inflation. Then there's a bucket, I would say, and again, I'm being simplistic. There's a bucket on safety, security, and corruption is there, right? And fighting corruption. So again, I welcome this new initiative. And in 1996, actually, the president of the World Bank, James Wolfensohn, characterized corruption as a cancer that really is impacting our institutions and our societies, and especially in the developing world. And this takes a big toll. Corruption, the World Economic Forum has estimated a few years ago that if you value the amount that is lost in corruption, it would be the 10th the 10th largest economy in the world. So it's, it's staggering. And we do have the tools to fight this plague. But unfortunately, in the past 10 years, according to Transparency International, anti-corruption efforts have stalled. They have the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, which they have been doing for a while, and out of 180 countries that they surveyed, 131 have not made a lot of progress. So I don't want to be, a bummer, but we do have the tools, and with this new strategy, hopefully, we get the anti-corruption agenda back at the top. And so I want to begin with Jen. If you kindly could talk a little bit about the highlights of the strategy and what's really new, because as I mentioned at the beginning, the US has done a lot and has been a leader in this fight. So Jen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I'll just start out by saying that it has been the privilege of USAID to be heavily involved in the development of this strategy, which was really a whole of government effort across the United States government, with departments and agencies ranging from the Department of State to Justice to Treasury and, of course, USAID. And I think it's important to start with that because the strategy is unique in a number of ways. It certainly lays out, I think, the problem sets that you so aptly captured. The fact that corruption, while it's not a new problem, it's a problem as old as time, has increased in scope and scale, not just over the past 10 years, but presumably longer. And really, it has increased as our own world has globalized. So corruption has globalized as well, with networks and coalitions and systems that allow corrupt actors to exploit weaknesses at country levels and also weaknesses in our global financial system to really impact the futures of citizens around the world. This is not a problem of the developing world. It is a global problem and one that has its roots and genesis as well in the developed world. And so I think it bears noting that the president had been very clear, even in his, before he took office, that countering corruption would be central to his foreign policy because he saw it as an issue of national security. We, of course, see it through our own unique development lens. Mm-hmm. And so early on in the process of this administration, an effort was put in place to really understand and unpack the dynamics of corruption and what the key issues were. What were the constraints? We knew we had some of the tools and we had some of the partnerships, but we really didn't have the dragnet in place that we needed to really stop and arrest corruption in its tracks. And so starting from that point, the goal was really to address this new scope and scale of corruption, to really understand and unpack the transnational dynamics while also not minimizing the corruption that citizens experience every day when there's a police shakedown or when they have to pay a bribe to enroll their child in school. Those are all critical constraints to development and to human development experiences that are fundamental. But an understanding that there was also a larger piece here that perhaps wasn't getting captured. The piece that allows oligarchs to fund wars, the piece that allows kleptocrats to steal their country's wealth, right, and hide it in apartments in Miami. And so the issue here was really addressing that transnational piece. The other piece, I think, was acknowledging the role that the United States plays in corruption. I think for the first time ever, having a president and administration brave enough to say that the United States and other developed countries play a role as a safe haven, as a destination country for the proceeds of corruption, for illicit finance, for money laundering. And so the strategy really has as its base this idea of a whole of government, a whole of US government approach to countering corruption, bringing to bear all the many tools we have, from sanctions and deterrence tools to detection, prevention, and of course the kind of work that we do at USAID along the prevention, institutional strengthening, accountability, citizen empowerment work. The other thing that really was critical was the idea of bringing in new partners, innovators, new partnerships, not just across the U.S. government, but in civil society and media, with other governments, multilateral partners. The idea that really this was not a go-it-alone situation. It wasn't all hands on deck kind of crisis. And then the last thing I'll just point out is that for the first time ever, the United States has never had a U.S. strategy on countering corruption. And so this allows us to work, hopefully, more seamlessly as a U.S. government to bring to bear the tools we do have. It also requires us to up our game. So it means rethinking the way we have done our work, questioning the assumptions we have made, digging deep into the data and analysis, and really trying to hold ourselves accountable, while also empowering local actors to do the same. So I'll stop there by noting that these are some of the elements that I think make this strategy unique and compelling, and also incredibly difficult and challenging to implement.
Yes, you have a very easy job, I guess.
Yes.
So when did the task force, when was it set up? Was it set up last year or?
Yes, so in response to, many in the audience may know that last June the President issued a National Study Security Memorandum, which designated the fight against corruption as a core national security priority. That really launched the strategy process, and in doing so, it was sort of a challenge to departments and agencies to rise to the occasion. And you know, we are fortunate to have an administrator who loves a good challenge, and she launched our anti-corruption task force to really surge support across the agency, and really allow us to focus and prioritize. Those who may be familiar with Usaid or have worked at Usaid before know that it's not an easy task to stand up a task force. You have to have a really compelling reason. We have task force on COVID, on the Northern Triangle, and arguably corruption's not an emergency, right? Except for that we know it is. And so I think that kind of prioritization was what was driving her structuring of the task force.
So how does the strategy translate into USAID's work?
That's a great question. So we were very intimately involved in developing the strategy, as I mentioned. It was an interagency process that really was trying to look at what we do and then ask where the gaps are and where we needed to go. So a big portion of what the task force has done has been feeding into the strategy, but that now the strategy is out in the world, we can't just let it sit there. How we actually implement it is what matters. Yeah. So we've begun a process internally we started with a process internally of sort of digesting what we've done, of stock taking, and then of going out to bureaus and offices across the agency to really try to think through ways that we can make individual contributions that contribute to this broader strategy. But our overarching goals are to elevate, integrate, and strengthen our programming. And so we've done so in a number of ways. The first is really around that elevation piece. It means the first step was standing up the task force. We know we need more resources, we need more staff, we need more staff in missions, we need more programs. We need to do more anti-corruption programs in more places. Second, we need to adapt our programming. A lot of our programs, and this is by design, Usaid is a highly decentralized agency. We give a lot of credence to our knowledge of local contexts, and we are driven by our desire to address country-level objectives. And that is important, but also insufficient if we are looking to try to address transnational corruption. And so trying to look at new ways of addressing both of those layers of corruption. You know, for example, addressing procurement weaknesses, which particular interests of Jeannie's that may exist at the government level that corrupt actors, whether they are external, internal, whether they are working on grand corruption or more sort of systemic or administrative corruption, that they are able to exploit. It may mean strengthening cooperation, right, amongst countries, information sharing, case referral. It may mean strengthening illicit finance rules and some of the transparency, beneficial ownership rules and other international standards that really are trying to get at these sort of these international and global networks that transnational actors are able to exploit. So we're looking to adapt our programming with new guidance and new programs. We launched a whole new series of programs at the Summit for Democracy. Some of you may have heard about them. This suite of bold new programs is aimed squarely at the transnational aspects of corruption for the first time ever. Never really had a lot of central programming for anti-corruption. And it's really aimed at building coalitions and partnerships. So in civil society, in investigative journalism and media space, and then of course with government reformers, building the kinds of coalitions, peer learning, and exchange that's needed, a network to fight a network, right? As well as our brand new Countering Transnational Corruption Grand Challenge, which is really seeking to source innovation, crowdsource solutions to these issues. And then the final thing that I'll just mention is that we've been working heavily on our integration agenda. And again, those of you who are maybe in the DRG space already will know that integration has been a priority for the agency for the past 15 years at least. But we've never really had the hook that we have with anti-corruption. Anti-corruption stymies all development objectives. It doesn't matter whether it's health or education or vaccine delivery. Corruption is an impediment and often is something that is acknowledged but not squarely addressed. And so we understand that both to achieve our sectoral outcomes and to be able to attack corruption from multiple angles, we need to integrate anti-corruption across all of USAID's portfolio, the development side and the humanitarian side. And it's a tall order. It's what this team has been working with me on. I'm so grateful to have their expertise and the expertise of our colleagues across other offices to look at the dynamics within each sector, understand and unpack the way corruption manifests, and then find some windows of opportunity or some entry points to addressing it, either through integrated programming or perhaps just sectoral programming that has elements of anti-corruption, citizen oversight committees on the use of health funds, for example, or transparency requirements around water service delivery. These are not, none of them individually will allow us to attack corruption, but if we are doing this consistently on all of our programs, we are getting closer to that root cause.
Wonderful. You mentioned different sectors, so I wanted to shift a little bit to your colleagues. You know, a lot of the hotspots on corruption happen, as you mentioned, in global, procurement, infrastructure development, public finance. So USA does a lot of work on domestic resource mobilization, and also something that's not very sexy, that is trade and customs administration. So I wanted to turn to Musa to ask you, how are you looking at the intersection of your work in these areas of economic growth, also working with the private sector, because corruption is not just a public sector problem, right? So tell us a little bit how your sector is approaching the anti-corruption agenda.
Yeah, thank you a lot, Romina. I think in terms of in the economic growth space, there's a lot that we've been doing for a long time already. It's not always called, anti-corruption efforts in name, but that's essentially, it's very adjacent to that, and it's what it really seeks to address, right? And for those of you who are kind of familiar with economic growth in USAID, you might know that we had an economic growth policy that came out last year. We're 2022, so 2021. It came out, and it was an update on a policy that we had back in, a strategy we had back in 2008. So it'd been a while, and it was in great need for a refresh. And in that refresh, what basically came out was that we really put firms at the center of the model of our economic growth policy. It really means that we seek to have firms of all sizes grow, and in order to achieve that, there are obviously some values that are behind that, including engaging the private sector in the process of achieving that, but also creating an environment that is conducive for those businesses, those firms to grow. And naturally, corruption is a significant part of that, right? Because on the private side, you may have instances of elite capture that you're going to need to address, but also on the public side, there are just burdens that are placed on businesses that need to be addressed as well. There are asymmetries of information that call for greater transparency, and there are just these, kind of these hurdles that the businesses may have to go through that are going to impose, arbitrary fees or rent seeking on them. So that's kind of what we're doing around our own policy. I think Jen already referred to this, but there's also a lot of intertextuality between, the new strategy on countering corruption at the U.S. government level, and also, the root causes strategy on addressing migration in Central America. And specifically on the first two pillars. The first pillar focuses specifically on economic security, which obviously also, in the context of Central America, what it seeks to address in large part is elite capture. And in addition to that, corruption on a much broader scale, and I think, Jen, that falls a little more into the democracy, governance, and human rights space. So I don't know, maybe you might want to pick up on that. But there's that kind of intertextuality in terms of how what we're doing in the economic growth space relates to other strategies within the U.S. government. And then I also said that obviously there's a lot that we've already been doing around trade facilitation, for instance, greater transparency, the training of customs officers specifically, to prevent trade in the customs chain. To prevent corruption in the customs chain. A lot of regulatory reform, specifically to reduce the costs. Like I said before, the arbitrary fee charging, accession to various trade agreements. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement is one that we are very well poised to support in terms of implementation, that also has enshrined in it a lot of these values around transparency and accountability that create obviously the opportunities for more inclusive and open trade. And standards. Whether they be for actual devices such as medical supplies and things that might prevent counterfeiting, which is obviously born out of or comes out of corruption, and then also leveraging the multilateral space. So we specifically on the economic growth side have a lot of linkages to the World Trade Organization, to the International Trade Center, to the World Bank Group, including the International Finance Corporation, and really leveraging those spaces for basically for collaboration, so that we can scale some of the work that we are already doing within USAID. And then last but not least, using a lot more economic analysis in the work that we do to really pinpoint where corruption is happening and how we can better address it. So those are kind of that's the direction that we have been moving in, and that we're really looking to integrate into the broader economic, the broader strategy on countering corruption within the U.S. government.
Wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned other agencies, how you are working with, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. The USTDA has a very interesting GPI initiative where they train procurement officers. The Development Finance Corporation works with the private sector in developing countries. So, and of course you have Treasury and others, Commerce. How are you thinking of working with them? And you've already been working with them, but the interagency process. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think across the agency, and particularly in the economic growth space, we already have existing, agreements with other agencies to provide technical support in areas that are not necessarily, just USAID's forte, but they also, there's significant expertise in other parts of the U.S. government. And I'll give you an example on this, on something that I work on specifically, which relates to the Federal Trade Commission and its work around competition policy and consumer protection in various countries. Most recently, we were working in Ukraine, and we're actually continuing that work to not lose the momentum, right? To continue working with a lot of these counterparts that have been trained for many years now on anti-corruption measures, on measures that make sure that mergers and acquisitions are transparent and they're done properly. So that's one example. Obviously, there is the natural relationship and collaboration between the State Department and USAID, and as you know, on the the root causes strategy, State Department and USAID are leading on those together. So there's a lot of collaboration in addressing a lot of the corruption-related issues, for example, in that strategy together jointly. So, I think among us, among the colleagues, we could probably think of a few more examples of, interagency agreements that we have in collaborations to address corruption.
Great. I wanted to now focus on Jeannie, on, global health, if I may. At least USAID is, I last checked, provides 10 billion out of the 25 billion in commitments to global health. And so I'm very curious. I'm not a health expert. I'm more of like economic development. So can you tell us a little bit how, global health and anti-corruption link?
Well, I'll start by saying that I also am not a global health expert. And in fact, my task over the past couple of months has been to work with a number of our global health colleagues who unfortunately couldn't join us today to do this exercise to unpack what does anti-corruption mean in the context of global health at USAID. And in this exercise, we discovered a couple things. The first thing is that the corruption challenges in the health systems where we work in our partner countries are really diverse, right? You have things that are happening at the service delivery level. You have informal payments that are being requested of patients. You have pharmaceutical theft in supply chains for pharmaceuticals. And you have things that are happening that are transnational, like the trade in counterfeit medicines that Musa was referring to earlier. The second thing that we found out was that health sector corruption has really a wide and devastating impact. When we look into it, we found that in low-income countries, 80% of patients at public health facilities had experienced some form of corruption in their interaction with the public health sector. That's staggering, 80%. And if we take the specific example of counterfeit medicines, a 2018 article found that between 13 and 18% of essential medicines, when they were tested, they failed that quality testing. So the real life impact of those counterfeit medicines in the medical field is devastating. If you just take the example of malaria, there are as many as 450,000 people annually who die because of substandard and counterfeit medicines related to malaria. These are preventable deaths that can be addressed by improving the detection, the prevention of these medicines entering into the public health systems. So what does this mean for USAID's programming? Regardless, in the health sector, regardless of what the disease type we're working on, regardless of the level in the health system that we're working in, there's something that we can do to address corruption that will affect the health outcomes. This is not just work that is for democracy and governance advisors. This is work across the agencies that's critically important for USAID to achieve its development outcomes.
Wonderful. Yeah, and I wanted to talk a little bit about, you mentioned informal payments. Musa mentioned, customs administration. Of course, you have public finance issues. And how does technology play into the anti-corruption fight? Technology is a tool, and we've seen, in the past years, an increase in digitization. So is it a tool that will help, implement the agenda? Will it hinder it? I know USAID also launched its first ever technology strategy in 2020. So can you talk a little bit about, the intersection of technology and anti-corruption in your fields? Yeah.
Sure. So I can speak a bit for what we discovered on the health sector side of things. There's definitely ways in which different types of technologies are being applied to address corruption in the health sector. For example, there are new less expensive technologies that are being rolled out for detecting some of these counterfeit medicines to make it more cost effective to have more points in that supply chain where you're testing for counterfeits. That's one thing. Another thing is the use of AI. USAID itself is starting to use AI in detecting red flags in the supply chains that we're involved in, so that when we can see those corruption risks, we can identify them early before there is a loss of foreign assistance resources in the health sector and redress those weaknesses. Hopefully. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's the idea. We're moving to leverage that data that's available to really work to quickly shore up those systems. Another thing that's very important for the health sector, again, because of the volume of procurements that go through the health sector, but is broadly applicable for public sector purchasing, is use of things like blockchain, for example, in public procurement and contracting systems. So there's a lot of different ways you can think about technology playing in, and I think we very much looked at this audience, these implementers, to keep on innovating, bringing these new ideas to bear, because I think when we all get together and we open our minds, there's a lot that can be done.
Yes, Musa?
Yeah, I wanted to piggyback a little bit on what Jeannie is saying about maybe technology, maybe in the less technical sense of, maybe screening certain types of medications, but actually in the idea of creating feedback loops between government and businesses and government and citizens, and how that operates to basically flag, issues around corruption, right? When you have an ICT-based system that facilitates those types of feedback loops. One, there's likely a greater chance that if it's an anonymous process, people are actually going to report the types of issues that they're dealing with. And if it's, if it's processed by a machine or AI or whatever the likes, people are also more likely to be honest and forthright. And then there's the other aspect of just facilitation payments, period, right? When you have a digitized system, there's less likeliness that you're going to end up in a situation where you have to bribe an official. So a lot of the work that USAID has been doing on digitization over decades now, is to advance that cause in particular. But as one of the major good regulatory practices that we kind of support in the economic growth sector is specifically the GRP around feedback loops and how you create those using technology.
Jennifer, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, no, I just want to, echo, of course, what my colleagues have said, and the importance of leveraging the tools and the approaches that we've known for a long time, but also just to caution that we are aware, of course, that these are tools, right? The data that is used, the data that is gathered, rather, through these detection tools, or the data that it may be gathered through citizen reporting, is imperative and also requires government to do something with it, right? So you need a willing recipient on the other end who's actually willing to take that information and do something about closing the loophole or addressing the issue. And so I think, to your earlier point, we see it as a tool and not the end game, right? It is a way to minimize discretion, to increase transparency and openness, in the hopes that it drives greater accountability. But it must be paired with accountability approaches as well.
Yeah, because it can be used for, bad purposes as well, right? And also, who are the companies that we're working with, both in the United States and on the ground. So my question now goes to a little bit about this working with partners. I know USAID works with big implementing partners that are based in the United States, and now there's a little bit of a wave to shift to working with local partners. This has happened with in the Obama administration as well, right? I think it was Administrator Shah that also proposed localization, I guess is the word. I don't know. And so I wanted to ask you about on the one hand, we want development to be, demand-driven and foster the capacity of local actors. But on the other hand, we also want, to safeguard taxpayers' money and investments, of course. So how do you see, this balance of, of creating that local ecosystem, but also providing, accountability and transparency to, this complex industry, let's say. So, Jen, if you want to go first.
Sure, yeah. Well, I guess I'd start at the outset by just saying that we do not see localization as being at odds with the anti-corruption agenda. In fact, we see them as being mutually reinforcing, right? We cannot achieve the goals we seek on anti-corruption without supporting and empowering local actors. There is no way that anyone sitting in this room from Washington, D.C., ourselves included, is able to actually affect the kind of change that needs to happen in all countries without being there, without being part of that system and understanding that system. And so local actors are essential to our anti-corruption approach. They are not just a percentage that we would like to allocate of our assistance dollars. They need to be put in the driver's seat. We have a colleague who is no longer in the DRG Center. She's out in one of our missions, but she used to always talk about her sidekick manifesto, about donors being the sidekick. We are there as a facilitator. We are not the protagonist. And so I think that we understand that as the same, one and the same. The drive on localization is about more than just empowering local actors, though. It is ultimately about the sustainability of our efforts. And I think anyone who's worked on anti-corruption knows that we invest heavily in countries and systems and institutions, in CSOs and in oversight and in systems and technology systems. And a new government will rise to power, and that can all change. We've seen it in country after country where things change. And the durability of these reforms over political transition is only possible if it is owned locally. Because when donors move away, when donors shift gears, when donors focus on new things, it is local institutions that carry the baton forward. And so I think it's perhaps a false choice to make it a question of if one or the other. On the safeguarding piece or the safeguarding U.S. taxpayer assistance, obviously that's our goal and our role and is our duty as an agency. And it's something we take seriously, but also there is no empirical proof that local organizations are more or less corrupt than any other organization. The risks exist no matter what country and no matter with what partner we are working. It is true that some local organizations find it difficult to sort of mitigate, to have the capacity to mitigate that risk and to work effectively as as agents of the United States in terms of safeguarding the foreign assistance dollars that they are awarded. And so that is part of the localization push, is to build that capacity. It's not our goal to throw money out in the world with no safeguards. It is our goal to empower local actors to use foreign assistance dollars for local development. So.
And how will the, thank you for that, how will the strategy impact, let's say, the bigger implementing partners? Do you see a change? So are there any, things you could share with us? Yeah.
Well, I worked for big implementing partners before. In fact, I see some friends here in the audience. I won't talk about how this might affect your new business plans, but I will. I will just say that I think that just as with us, the strategy provides a North Star. I think for anyone who works in this space, and it's not hidden, it's not procurement sensitive, it's right there in the public document, that the focus must be on the increasingly transnational aspects of corruption. It must be about partnership and localization. It must be about bringing together the multiple tools that exist, and it must be about questioning our assertions and assumptions. It must be about evidence and data and impact. And so those are the things that perhaps you may want to write in your pillars in your technical approach section. No, okay, just kidding. those are the things we're focusing on. Those are the things that everyone in this room has expertise and creativity to bring into this. And so no, I don't think it has any particular impact other than perhaps opening the door to more ideas. You know, broadly speaking, the agency is focused on co-creation and on really trying to change the way we do our own business. So most recently, and this is public, there was a request for information for one of our programs on the Summit for Democracy, and we received a very robust set of responses from this community and those outside it actually as well, that help to inform our approach. And so that's what we need, more dialogue and more information sharing on how to really move the needle in this space.
So I'm cognizant of the time, and I know we have a lot of expertise in this room. So I wanted to open the floor to comments or questions from the audience. We have about 10 minutes left, and there are microphones in the in the middle of the room. And please state. I think the gentleman was first, but please. Okay.
Don't make me
Please
look
state
bad.
your name and your affiliation. And I will take maybe 2 questions.
Thank you very much. I'm Chloe Schwenke. I'm the president of the Center for Values in International Development. A comment, and that is, this is a really depressing topic. It can lead us to some very cynical views on human nature. But I would like to ask you the question of, are you looking at the other side? Are you looking at the drivers of integrity, the drivers of public service, the values that would make us want to do the right thing for the right reason? Is this task force also a pro-integrity task force? Are we honoring public servants who really are exemplars of integrity? If we can't believe that integrity can exist, we might as well give up. I don't think we're in any position to give up. I think there's a huge reservoir of really important values that support all of these good things we want out of our societies and our economies. But if you don't look for it, you're not going to find it. Thank you.
Yes, the gentleman, please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ayman. Before working for international development, I actually grew up in a country in North Africa called Tunisia 12 years ago, when the events of the revolution, at the time it wasn't called the revolution yet, we started a little something that that turned out to become the first anti-corruption organization in the country, and now it's the leading one, and the local chapter for Transparency International. So my question is, I heard a lot of great stuff about what's going on right now, the plans for the future, strategies, etc. But what are we doing to undo the results and the effects of decades of what have preceded these strategies? Like we can't really estimate it accurately, but we have like the exact, the equivalent of the Tunisian budget laying in Switzerland and in Mauritius and other countries. So what are we doing to undo the results of that, of those decades of corruption? Thank you.
Okay, we'll answer these 2 and then take the next one.
Okay, great. So thank you for your question, Chloe. No, it's a really important point. A long time ago, I worked in internal investigations in one of your organizations. I remember I attended a training from an OIG officer who got up and she said, I work on fraud and I see it around every corner. And I thought, oh my God, what a depressing line of work. And yet here I am on the anti-corruption task force. It is extremely depressing, but it's exactly why we need to work on it. But to your point, integrity is central to our anti-corruption approach. Like we cannot just be focusing on the sanctions and the enforcement. And at the same time, we cannot just be focusing on integrity measures. They need to be married up. One thing we are doing that may be of interest is that, you know, the broader push in the agency to focus on social behavioral norms and even most recently the appointment by the administrator of a Usaid economist again and the standing up of an entire behavioral economics team within our PPL bureau is really driving the use of this sort of lens in our programming. So not just looking at the drivers, but at the norms, at the social norms that are drivers and that enable corruption and that allow it to persist and that feed it and nurture it. And so what that means for our programming. And so we've actually commissioned a study on this very topic. It's underway right now with a series of case studies. And this is an internal study that we hope to really help us pivot our programming to work on some of those behavioral pieces. Yes, how do we incentivize reformers? How do we elevate their work and champion them? And we're not alone, I should say. You know, the State Department issued an Anti-Corruption Champions Award a year and a half ago on International Anti-Corruption Day. This is part of the sort of recognizing, especially local actors who are against all odds and often at great risk to their own personal safety, doing the right thing on anti-corruption and really trumpeting that and making it known. So it absolutely is part of our approach on integrity.
And the Tunisia.
Yes. So,
yeah.
and then I'll let others pitch in. And so I'm on very good point on what we refer to as decluptification. We're actually issuing a guidance soonish on decluptification, what you do when there is a window of opportunity to address longstanding, entrenched systems of corruption, systems that have perpetuated the entire political system in some contexts and the economic system, and sort of what you do first. And there's no one answer for that, but the kinds of considerations that you can consider in supporting efforts around that. So whether it's bringing, you know, certain anti-corruption cases forward to show an impact that you're doing that, whether it's engaging not just in following the money, but trying to actually work with other countries to recover the money, asset recovery, whether it's you know, working on another series of issues around sort of closing loopholes to safeguard the system while you promote reform within. And so it's absolutely something that's on our mind, is what we do when there are these opportunities to really dismantle longstanding systems of graft and corruption.
All right, there's a few more questions. Yes.
Hi, my name is Amber Moffett from American Institutes for Research, and one of the areas that we do a lot of work in is third-party monitoring, which, you know, which is a huge mechanism for accountability. And so I'm kind of curious, you know, with your task force and strategizing moving forward, also, you know, in the sectors, particularly in health, in procurement, what are you discussing in terms of what you're seeing that is working really well and what's not working well, and what role do you see third-party monitoring playing in the future, or other mechanisms also, because you know, third-party monitoring is just one of many mechanisms. So what are those mechanisms specifically that you're looking at really focusing on because they're doing a lot of good?
Little, and I've had the pleasure of serving as in 35 different countries with the UN and USAID funded implementation projects. The number one thing that I've seen in all of these, that crosses the sector, is the corruption issue. And I've worked for CIGAR, and I've also stood up anti-corruption committees and institutions in 3 different countries. So what I have personally seen, and I'm so grateful for this task force and for the strategy, because you're speaking to all of the things you're speaking to, most of the economic, you know, analysis part of it. These things sometimes are done individually, but not as a group. The citizens' action or citizens' engagement, the localization, all of that. What I have seen, though, is the one thing we haven't really discussed here, is that when we see, often we don't understand the problem, firstly. So I've been part of anti-corruption programming or accountability programming on a national level, where we're 6 months into programming and we're role-playing, taking a bribe versus not paying a bribe, and then we find out that all of these civil servants have actually had to pay for their position. Right, and that's 6 months into a national program, that every single civil servant had to pay for their position. And we saw the same thing with the Afghan police, and little wonder that they disappeared. So, you know, we seem not to be able to, we don't really do a mapping in the beginning of our understanding of, because it plays out differently in every country, as we know. So we don't really seem to have a problem analysis that's done at the very beginning, and then the work with the citizenry to empower them, as you're rightly saying, because we can't be the watchdogs. But what I've seen is the NGO community are working on the empowering of the citizens, and then we, the international, you know, because I've been mostly with state aid and UN, we're working on the institution building, and never the two should meet.
Apologies.
And so the question is, so Oh, yes, sorry. So the question is, conditionalities have not been mentioned. And the idea of aid conditionalities based on the big tiger in the room that we are seeing, what can we do with that regard? Thank you.
So the question on third-party monitoring and conditionality.
Okay, on the third-party monitoring, I think this is an incredibly important piece of the puzzle. It's not the only thing, and it needs to be used in conjunction with other modalities, but for the health sector specifically, we've seen it come through in a number of ways. It's important as a safeguard with respect to the use of U.S. government foreign assistance. We're actively using it in fragile and conflict-affected states. For example, in Yemen, we use third-party monitoring as a part of our safeguarding mechanism there. That's very important for our own programming in terms of detection and prevention of corruption. In that arena, we use this type of monitoring in the case of our pharmaceutical supply chain work. For example, doing monitoring of markets after the fact to see if those same pharmaceuticals that we have provided via our programming are showing up in marketplaces. We also use it in the context of monitoring of public international organizations. We have massive amounts of funds that go through those systems, and third-party monitoring is increasingly being used as a tool in that area.
Sure, I'll just also add on the third-party monitoring that it's something that we're thinking beyond sectoral applications, just as a general tool that can help us to, more broadly point in the direction of whether our interventions are actually having an impact. So I just wanted to mention that. On conditionality, I actually thought, Elizabeth, I'm not sure where she went, sorry, I can't really see the crowd, so apologies. First of all, you should come work for us. With all your 35 countries experience, that's fantastic. I thought you were going to ask a question about assessment and understanding the broader context, but I'll go ahead and answer both of those things because I think they're actually related. I think one of the things that the strategy acknowledges, if you dig into some of the language, is that we really lack a whole of government operational picture in the countries in which we work. And you can understand that, those of you who've worked in government too, that assessments are siloed and sort of assessment frameworks are specific to DOD or to USAID or State Department or whatever, and often don't speak to each other. We're not often using the same metrics and the same data points. And so we've acknowledged that we need better joint assessment and understanding of the context. And internal to the government, that means more information sharing between agencies. We also need to do greater mapping. And we have a lot of great work that's come out of this agency over the past 2 decades on political economy analysis, thinking and working politically, but then also on systems mapping and understanding the systemic nature of any development challenge. And so as we boost and I didn't really reference this at the beginning, but one of the things that the task force is doing is, of course, is trying to boost the resources we have internal to the agency, the technical resources that we have on anti-corruption to really push our anti-corruption work forward, transform it. And so one of those tools will be a refresh of our highly outdated strategies and toolkits on these issues, and our highly outdated assessment framework, which still has great bones, because really great people, some of whom may be here today, worked on that. But trying to really take into account this full thing, this full picture. On conditionality, I don't think that we would express it that way. That's not the way we discuss it. But I think those who have watched this administrator know that she's not shy to change positions when we are working with an unwilling partner. If any of you watched what happened in El Salvador with the decision to stop working directly with public institutions, you'll know that she is squarely sort of trying to put our partners on notice that we will work with willing partners. And that has to be part of our analysis going into our program design. The last thing I'll say is that earlier when I mentioned integration, it's certainly true that we're trying to integrate into sectors, but institutionally we're trying to integrate anti-corruption into the fiber of the agency, which means understanding the way it plays throughout the program cycle. So understanding it at the CDCS stage, at the strategy development stage, right, at the program design stage, at the monitoring and evaluation and learning stage, and throughout that entire life cycle. So bringing back, the kinds of lessons we need to understand what the next program should be, or, and this is always hard for us to say, that we should not program anymore in this space, in this context, because we do not have a willing partner anymore. So,
So last 3 questions, very brief.
I'm at Chemonics now, but was until recently a colleague of Jen's and Janine's at the DRG Center. And you actually kind of just answered my question, which was about assessment and about assessment frameworks and how do we figure out, like, what is the environment? How do we understand the nuances, but the differences between different countries, the different kinds of corruption that we're thinking about, the different levels from like the retail to the wholesale to the transnational levels of corruption. But I wonder if you could talk about it, and maybe Jeanine can pitch in on this, sort of the specific sectoral analysis that has to go into this. I know that for a while, I don't know if they did it when it was DFID, I don't know if the FCDO may have dropped this, was actually asking all of its sectors to do specific anti-corruption analysis. And I wonder if that's something that AID is considering, and especially because sort of I think that the experience, you know, when you work with missions, and this is from the implementer side too, you often come into this barrier of, are we going to talk about anti-corruption or are we going to talk about accountability, right? To what extent are people willing to accept that corruption is a problem, and to what extent do you need to sort of couch it in some semi-euphemistic, like, oh, we're going to do systems strengthening sorts of approaches? Like, how are you thinking about those systemic assessments to be honest about the problems are?
That was not short.
Oh, come on. That was pretty short.
Next, yes.
I'll try to be short. This is Uzma Barton. I'm from Nathan Associates. There has been mention of sectoral corruption, and then there has been mention of onboarding civil society organizations, private sector, all those other actors who can support an AIDS initiative on anti-corruption. I'm wondering, one, public institutions have been missing. If we do not have a buy-in from them, how can we actually get it, have our those countries where we are working them, have them in the driving seat? Referring to the question that just came before, the comment, the euphemism or the kind of use of the phrases we use, if we do not include public sector institutions, how it thinks that its efforts can be sustainable after the projects are completed.
Okay, and last one.
Thank you. So similar to the last 2 comments, how do you meaningfully engage on corruption in insecure environments where it puts participants, staff, partners at risk?
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, quick answers.
Okay, on the sectoral assessment, I think that there are a number of interesting assessment frameworks that are out there, and there are ones that we can build upon. So if we take the health sector and specifically, the WHO has a health systems assessment tool. There's an addendum to that systems assessment tool that is specifically related to anti-corruption. So we're not alone in this. A lot of donors are already getting around this problem set. I think that's a great option, particularly if you're working on a multi-donor coordinated effort. Similarly, USAID's own health system strengthening assessment has modules that are very relevant to the corruption challenges. So it's a huge module. I think the health sector folks told me that it takes about $500K to do the whole thing, so they barely do the entire thing. But if we would very much encourage health offices to look at those modules to touch on corruption issues and to specifically hone in on those when they're designing programming.
Buy-in from the public sector?
Great, yeah, buy-in from the public sector is essential. I mean, public institutions matter. We cannot just have an approach that exclusively works with external actors just because we think there's no political will, a term I personally dislike because it implies that there's some kind of monolithic government will, and we probably don't even have the same will. I don't know. Maybe we do. So I think the issue is understanding that sometimes there are governments with whom we cannot work directly on corruption. And so the question is, do we do the euphemistic approach and kind of allow them to continue to receive our assistance under the veneer of good governance, or do we just pivot to willing partners outside of government? And I think we're looking at that on a case-by-case basis, because sometimes really the goal should be to lay the foundation for the next window of opportunity that may arise to work with the public sector. The one thing we don't want to do is throw, good money after bad. If we've been working with public institutions that have not demonstrated true commitment to countering corruption, we need to question what we're doing. On insecure environments, I mean, the only thing I can just say is that, I think we understand corruption as a key driver of insecurity. And as we look to integrate this across our work, we know we need to understand corruption not just as like one of many ills that operate in the a fragile space environment, but as something that we need to figure out ways to concretely address. And it may be that an OTI program or a CMM program or whatever is not positioned to work on that issue. It may be that a humanitarian assistance response is not positioned to work on that issue, but that is where we as an agency need to be speaking amongst ourselves to see what other programming may be available to strengthen that response. And so obviously the safety of our partners is paramount.
All right, I'm sorry we went over, and thank you for your patience. Let's please give a round of applause to our panelists.